Hello, I'm Smay Ceylan and you're watching Playback, Tier 2 World's weekly showcase of our best stories from around the globe. Coming up. At least 11 people are killed and others injured in Russian missile attacks on Ukraine as Western countries prepare to send tanks to Kiev. Muslim communities in Sweden send messages of peace after a politician is allowed to desecrate the Quran outside the Turkish Embassy in Stockholm. And the Finnish Ministry of Defense has agreed to lift its embargo on arms exports to Turkey, fulfilling one of Ankara's requirements for accession to Nato. Russian missiles continue to pound Ukraine this week. Kiev says Moscow launched 55 air and sea-based missiles in a barrage that followed decisions by the US and Germany to send heavy battle tanks to Ukraine. The missile followed a series of overnight drone attacks. As Sarah Morris reports, the move has infuriated Russia.
The heavy and sustained missile attacks struck broad areas of Ukraine, including here in the capital Kiev and the southern region of Odessa. Most were targeting the country's energy infrastructure, but as usual, residential areas were also caught up in the strikes.
I heard a roar and there was an extremely loud explosion. I was saved by the fact the strike hit one side of my house, but I was in the bedroom on the other side. I got out of the house walking over glass splinters. Not a single room is left intact.
The early morning barrage hit just hours after the US promised Ukraine 31 Abrams battle tanks and Germany pledged 14 of its Leopard tanks. Berlin also dropped export restrictions on its Leopards, paving the way for dozens more to be sent from other NATO countries. In the wake of the tank announcement, Russia released this footage of its fighter jets firing missiles on Ukraine and says it considers the West's plan to send tanks as direct involvement in the war.
The US and NATO are determined to further continue making efforts to drag this military conflict on, and they have become participants. At the same time, we have to understand that even with the conflict in Ukraine continuing, the West won't stop its proxy war against Russia and its allies.
In response, NATO drew attention to the fact Moscow is also receiving weapons from its allies.
Iran is delivering support to Russia, including drones that are used to attack civilian infrastructure, homes and hospitals in Ukraine. In return, Russia is stepping up its support to Iran.
In Germany, just a day after making the historic pledge to provide Kiev with tanks, the new Defence Minister Boris Pistorius announced they will be in Ukraine by the end of March. Poland, which has for some time been pressuring Germany on the tank issue, welcomed Berlin's commitment.
We see that the level of determination of a free world to defend Ukraine is increasing. Something taboo, the forbidden topic 6 months ago, has become a reality. It shows that all the discussions, diplomacy and pressure make sense.
But in Ukraine, the tanks can't come quickly enough, as Kiev residents were once again forced underground to shelter from the latest Russian missile attack. Their president was pressing for speedier delivery of the vehicles. He also wants fighter jets, but for now, allies are not willing to make that commitment. Sarah Morris, TRT World.
Well, Sweden's Muslim community sent messages of peace to politicians across Europe after a far-right politician burnt a Quran outside the Turkish Embassy in Stockholm. The Muslim world is calling on governments to stop the spread of religious hate crimes. Melinda Nusufora reports from the Swedish capital.
A show of respect in the same place the flames of disrespect burned over the weekend.
Müslümanların gereği zaten barışçılıktır.
Islam is a peaceful religion. The racist attack carried out here targeted all Muslims. It targeted the Turkish government. As a peaceful response, we handed out carnations and the Quran in Swedish.
The Turkish Swedish Society held a service to honour the Quran outside the Turkish Embassy in Stockholm on Tuesday. The peaceful demonstration was in direct response to this inflammatory display on Saturday. Far-right politician Rasmus Paludan was permitted to set fire to the Muslim holy book outside the embassy, evoking Sweden's vast freedom of expression laws.
Nobody has right to attack any nation, religion, or something this.
So today was about peace?
Yes, we are here for peace.
About 8% of Sweden's population identify as Muslim. Community leaders say the rise of far-right politics in Europe corresponds directly with the rise of Islamophobia. And they say the current cost of living crisis is only making the problem worse.
I believe that if the Swedish government enacts new laws to reverse its anti-foreign stance, it can remain in power for a long time. But if it continues in the direction it's going, the government could fall very soon.
Sweden's Islamic community is calling for politics built on peace, not fear. Melinda Nusafora, TRT World, Stockholm.
For the first time since 2019, Finland's defense ministry has issued a commercial export license for military material to be sold to Turkey. It's been a key demand for Ankara to approve Finland's bid to become a member of NATO. But the accession process appears to have stalled after Saturday's Quran burning incident in Stockholm. That's led to Ankara postponing a high-level NATO meeting with both Nordic nations. Hilal Uzun has more.
Finland and Sweden have hit a wall in talks on NATO accession. Earlier this month, supporters of the PKK terrorist organization in Stockholm hung an effigy of the Turkish president, escalating tension with Ankara. And on Saturday, a far-right politician burned a copy of the Quran outside the Turkish Embassy in Stockholm, a bridge too far for many in the Muslim world. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan strongly criticized the Swedish authorities for allowing the protest to go ahead.
It is very obvious those who allow such blasphemy in front of our embassy in Stockholm can no longer expect our support for their NATO membership.
This alarmed fellow candidate Finland. On Tuesday, Finnish Foreign Minister Pekka Haavisto hinted that his country could move on solo.
We have to assess the situation, whether something has happened that in the longer term would prevent Sweden from going ahead.
His Swedish counterpart responded, saying he was in contact with Haavisto and sought to clarify Finland's position. Later, Haavisto backpedaled, saying Helsinki's policy remained the same. But the implication alone was enough to stir up speculation in Finland.
Well, in Finland we are worried about this because Russia is like our neighboring country, but Sweden, we are kind of a buffer for Sweden, so I think that they are a little bit more safe. It sounds horrible, but that's how it is. So I don't think, maybe for them it doesn't feel like such a big risk.
Well, I think it would be a wise decision because our border is next to Russia and Sweden is further, and now they have major problems with Turkey, so I would appreciate it.
In October, citing differences between the two Nordic countries' approach to Turkey's security concerns, Erdogan indicated a willingness to support an independent bid from Finland.
Finland is not a place where terrorism is prevalent, but Sweden is. Therefore, Finland and Sweden, NATO has to make a decision. If NATO makes this decision in favor of Finland, we will do our best in this regard.
The two countries submitted a joint NATO application last year. But if Stockholm continues to fall short, Helsinki may have to make a choice. Hilal Uzun, TRT World.
On Thursday, at least 10 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces during a raid in the occupied West Bank. At least 20 others were injured in the operation on the Jenin refugee camp. Israeli forces say they acted to stop Palestinian militants who they said were planning a major attack. The Palestinian presidency has accused Israel of a massacre and has cut off all security cooperation. Mustafa Fatih Yavuz reports from occupied East Jerusalem.
Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank have got used to Israelis' almost daily military raids that usually turn into deadly clashes between Palestinians and Israelis. Thursday was no different. Israeli forces entered the refugee camp in Jenin in an operation to carry out arrests, and an exchange of fire followed. During the raid, Israeli forces killed several Palestinians, including a 60-year-old woman, Majid Obeid. Eyewitnesses said Israeli security forces surrounded the building where the wanted Palestinians were holed up.
There were young men who hid, fled into the house, and were bombed with weapons and missiles. Windows, doors, walls, and even the refrigerator were damaged by the Israeli forces' bullets.
The Israeli army say they were targeting Islamic Jihad members in the operation, who they say were allegedly planning to carry out multiple attacks, and there were no casualties from the Israeli side. 2022 was the deadliest year for Palestinians since 2006, and Israeli forces killed more than 200 Palestinians, most of whom were from the occupied West Bank. Last year's raids were ordered by Israel's previous government, but it's not clear whether this military incursion and the high number of casualties in Jenin are the result of the new Netanyahu government's far-right policies. A senior Israeli officer told the media this raid was to do with the threat level against the troops and was not because of a policy change. Nevertheless, some to the far right were ready to praise the raid.
I want to congratulate the anti-terrorism forces, the Israeli army, the Shin Bet, who last night fulfilled a successful operation, and we support our combat soldiers in the war against the terrorists, against the militants. Every policeman, every combat soldier, every soldier should know that they have full support from Israel's government, from the ministry.
While Israel's far-right government backed the raid, Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank showed their frustration during the funeral ceremony and warned about a possible escalation.
The massacre that the Israeli occupation army committed this morning in Jenin city confirms the racist, fascist and criminal right-wing occupation of the Israeli government. The resistance will always be ready to defend its people everywhere. This is an ongoing and escalating revolution until the occupation is kicked out of the entire Palestinian land.
So far, Israeli forces have killed at least 30 Palestinians in less than a month. And as there's still little sign of quiet in the occupied West Bank, leaving a possible escalation increasingly likely. Mustafa Fatih, Theatre World, occupied East Jerusalem.
While the investigation into the devastating Beirut Port explosion in 2020 has faced a series of obstacles. This week, there was a hint of forward movement until the investigating judge himself was called in for questioning. Imogen Kimber reports from Beirut.
2.5 years after the massive explosion in Beirut's port that killed 220 and caused billions of dollars of damage, many feel justice is an elusive concept they will never see, no matter how hard they fight.
This is my only son. I lost him because of the criminals in this country. We wanted the judges to find justice for our children. If there's no uprising and independent judiciary, then there is no country.
These families of the victims stand outside Lebanon's Palace of Justice, showing their support for the investigating judge, Tariq Battar. The judge found himself called in for questioning by the public prosecutor after he restarted the investigation this week, after a year's suspension, and summoned more than a dozen senior officials and politicians.
The decision that the public prosecutor is against the law because he is also accused in the blast of August 4th. Someone who is accused cannot take decisions, and he released those who have been detained in connection with the blast, but he doesn't have the right to do so.
The public prosecutor is even trying to have Judge Tariq Battar removed, without a clear reason for doing so. He's already the second judge to take up the case. A number of parliamentarians came to the courts to meet with the Minister of Justice and address what they see as an obstruction of justice.
They've been trying to do that for the last 13 months, but now they took a decision that they don't care about any kind of laws. Even in the dictatorships, they put a kind of law, a frame for any decision they take. They don't have a frame for that.
From the outset, many of the families of the victims have called for an international investigation, as they don't have faith that the system that allowed the blast to happen will provide accountability.
If the keepers of the house, if the leaders of this country are the criminals, are the ones that destroy this country, are the ones that kill their own people, therefore they have no say about sovereignty.
This memorial stands for those who are lost, but it means little if they don't have any answers over why they were killed, or why no one has been held accountable for the blast on August 4th, 2020, and why many of those implicated are still in power. Imogen Kimber, TRT World, Beirut.
Chris Hipkins has been sworn in as New Zealand's new Prime Minister following Jacinda Ardern's surprise resignation last week. Ardern left the Parliament for the last time as Prime Minister on Wednesday, as well-wishers waved and cheered. Her successor, Chris Hipkins, has held his first cabinet meeting and says his government's focus is tackling the cost of living crisis. Claire Harriott has more.
Jacinda Ardern walked out of New Zealand's Parliament building to cheers from staff and supporters.
Prime Minister!
She resigned last week as Prime Minister and plans to stay on as a backbench MP to avoid triggering early elections. She leaves office a popular leader, but public polls indicate the coalition government of Ardern's Labour Party and the Greens has a low approval rating. Chris Hipkins is the man whose job it is to turn that around. Hipkins has refused to announce his government's policies, but addressed New Zealand's inflation figures, which came out on his first day in office. 7.2% is low by global standards, but it's the highest it's been in New Zealand for decades.
And the numbers that we've seen today, I think, underline the importance of the commitment that I have made over the last few days to place the cost of living and the economic situation that we face as our number one priority as a government. Now, I've only been here for a couple of hours. Now I need to work through the options about what we do about that with my ministerial colleagues, and I will do that, and we will be making haste. But I'm not going to be so hasty as to make things up on the fly.
His deadline will be the general election on October 14th.
If the polls are correct and an election was held today, Labour or the left, the Labour and the Green Party, would lose. They say a week is a long time in politics. 9 months is a very long time in politics. And Chris Hipkins has announced today that he is absolutely about a reprioritisation of government away from those more aspirational agenda items that Jacinda Ardern wanted to achieve and looking at a really tight focus on the cost of living crisis.
Chris Hipkins says he's taken the baton of responsibility from Jacinda Ardern. His first day in office was light on detail, but New Zealanders will expect a full agenda soon. Claire Harriott, TRT World.
Canada has announced it will pay out more than $2 billion to hundreds of Indigenous communities to settle a lawsuit seeking compensation for the loss of language and culture caused by residential schools. Usman Aliyu Uba has the details.
Thousands of unmarked graves under pink flags. They were discovered over the past 2 years near former residential schools in Canada. Each represents one of the many Indigenous children that were taken away from their families and forced into those schools. Now, Canada has announced it will pay more than $2 billion to hundreds of Indigenous communities. The class action lawsuit by 325 Indigenous groups ended with the settlement, which will be placed in a trust fund independent of the government.
This is the first time Canada is compensating bands and communities as a collective for this type of harm in regards to residential schools, one that places language and culture at the center of healing to address the legacy of institutions that were aimed at destroying Indigenous heritage, Indigenous culture, Indigenous languages, and Indigenous identity.
For over a century, 150,000 Indigenous children were separated from their parents and placed in these so-called education centers. Many were physically and sexually abused. A National Commission of Inquiry in 2015 called the residential school system a cultural genocide, and hundreds of people protested, demanding an independent investigation.
The settlement comes after hundreds of graves were found near former residential schools, which piled pressure on the government. Today, less than 8% of children under 14 are indigenous, but more than 52% of them are in foster care. And while many activists call this settlement a historic victory, they say it is only the beginning of a long road to justice. Usman Aliyu Uba, TRT World.
Australia Day continues to divide the country. Some see it as a time to celebrate the young nation, but others see January 26th as a day of mourning. That's because the day also marks the start of colonization, which violently cut off Indigenous peoples from their lands and cultures. Tier 2 World's Craig Vermey has more.
For some, Australia Day is a day to celebrate what the country has become. Family and friends come together for barbecues and parties. But January 26 marks the landing of Britain's first fleet, which brought colonialists to Sydney's Botany Bay, a day that would forever change the face of the country. For the Indigenous people of Australia, the arrival of the first fleet in 1788 began an era of colonialism and oppression. And now there are calls for them to be part of the wider decision-making process in Parliament.
This whole march is to not support the voice to Parliament. We need something stronger than that. We are the voice. Us as Aboriginal people are the voice. We don't need the government telling us that.
Marches across Australia are calling for the date of the National Day to be changed. A day that has now been dubbed Invasion Day, and for many, not a day of celebration.
Because it's not a celebration for everyone when First Nations people have been this is the commencement of the day that they started the rape and genocide of their people.
I think it's really important that we come out and protest today and show support in any way we can for Indigenous Australians. It's actually the 85th day of mourning this year, so our Indigenous Australians have been protesting this for 85 years. It's not really televised, but it's been going on for so long, so yeah, I think it's important that we show up and we mourn with them.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says his government has no plans to move the date.
Today's a day that's important to celebrate who we are, but also to recognise the changing nature of Australia. The fact that we begin and trace our history back over 60,000 years should be a source of great pride.
But despite the parties across the country today, the tide may be turning here as the calls for change get louder and louder. Craig Vermey, TRT World on the Gold Coast.
Well, an ancient mosaic of a mysterious woman is a popular attraction in the eastern Turkish city of Gaziantep, famous for its natural and cultural beauty. Naim Öngören reports.
The largest of its kind, the Zeugma Mosaic Museum is home to unique antique relics and artifacts, such as a bronze of Mars, the Roman god of war, fountains from the same era, and of course, the famed Gypsy Girl. The museum received a record for 139,000 visitors last year and has been transformed into a significant destination and brand, which promotes Gaziantep and Turkey worldwide.
By 2022, 439,000 had visited the Zeugma Mosaic Museum. This is the highest number since the foundation. In 2021, after June, the tourism season began. We were closed before that due to the pandemic. Since the opening, many people have started to come and visit here. We expect in 2023 to exceed 600,000 visitors.
The Gypsy Girl, parts of which were returned from the United States in 2018 after being stolen 52 years ago, created an influx of visitors when she came home. Because the bottom part of her face is missing and her expression reminds many of another famous enigma, the Mona Lisa.
This is my second time here. The first time I was with my dear wife, and this time I'm here with my kids. I recommend all families come and visit here. This is the history of our land. We need to come and see. It's a very large and spacious museum. There is no country living with history but Turkey. There is no other country as intertwined with history as our country.
In addition, the museum received Turkey's Presidential Culture and Arts Grand Awards in 2012. It gives its visitors a flavor of the lifestyle, culture, and beliefs of the people living at that time in the city by recreating a life-size street built according to Roman architecture. Naim Öngören, TRT World.
Well, that rounds up your week of news here on Playback. Stay tuned to TRT World for the latest stories.